If you were born in the 1990s, someone made you a quiet set of promises. Show up on time, work hard, stay loyal. The house would come by 30, the career would build itself through patience, and life, if you just followed the steps, would eventually make sense. You absorbed all of it, not from a textbook, but from watching, from being told, from a world that seemed certain about what you were supposed to become. And then you grew up. You showed up on time. You worked hard. You stayed loyal. And somehow, none of the math added up. The job didn't feel like safety. The house stayed out of reach. The loyalty went unreturned. The promise wasn't broken loudly. It just quietly stopped applying. So here's the question no one's asking you directly. What do you do when you were built for a world that no longer exists?
Here's what made your experience genuinely different. Not harder than everyone else's. Different in a way that has no real historical parallel. You are the only generation that grew up in two completely separate psychological worlds and made the crossing while your brain was still deciding who you were. During adolescence, the limbic system, the brain's emotional core, is running at peak sensitivity. It is wired almost desperately for belonging, for social feedback, for the answer to one consuming question: do I matter to the people around me? At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for long-term thinking and identity stability, is still years from completion. You were, neurologically, wide open. Gen X went through that window before the internet existed. Gen Z never knew a world without it. But you had a self forming quietly in the analog world. And then, at exactly the most vulnerable moment, the entire feedback system changed. Suddenly, it was public, permanent, quantified. Likes became worth something. Silence became visible. The rules of belonging rewrote themselves overnight. You weren't broken. You were mid-construction when the blueprint changed. And that distinction matters more than you've been given credit for, though we haven't arrived at why just yet. At some dinner table, in some ordinary house, someone who loved you explained how life worked. Study hard, get the degree, find a stable job that offers benefits and a pension. Buy a home before you're too old to enjoy it. Start a family on a timeline that made sense. It wasn't presented as a theory. It was handed to you as a map. Specific, reliable, tested. Because for them, it had worked. Then you walked onto the graduation stage, carrying debt that took a decade to name properly. You entered a job market that had quietly replaced stability with flexibility. Their word, not yours. You watched the first apartment become the fourth apartment. You watched the house stay exactly out of reach no matter how responsibly you moved toward it. The map didn't warn you about any of that. Economists call what follows the scarring effect. When foundational expectations collapse during formative years, the brain doesn't just feel disappointed. It revises its baseline permanently. You didn't become pessimistic. You became calibrated to a reality that kept failing to deliver. That's not a character flaw. That's what happens when the floor moves and no one tells you the floor moved. Before any of this, before the profiles, the feeds, the follower counts, you had a self that was forming in private. It grew in bedrooms and schoolyards and long car rides with the window down. It was built from conversations that left no record, from embarrassments no one could screenshot, from interests you explored before anyone thought to have an opinion about them. That self was incomplete, the way all selves are at 15, but it was genuinely yours. Then the stage appeared, and a strange thing happened. Identity, which had always been something you lived, became something you performed, optimized, presented in the best available light, and then measured by response. Not once, privately in a journal, but continuously, publicly, in real time. And your generation received that stage before the private self had finished forming. Before you knew what you actually believed, you were already being asked to broadcast it. The result is something no diagnostic manual has cleanly named. You carry two versions of yourself simultaneously, the one who existed before the audience arrived and the one who learned to function inside it. They don't fully reconcile, and the distance between them is precisely where the exhaustion lives.
Here is what I want you to understand. You are not lost because you don't know who you are. You know exactly who you are when no one is watching. It's the audience that confuses you. That is not an identity crisis. That is the only rational response to being handed a public mirror before you'd finished looking at yourself in private. You know the feeling. You're scrolling, not even intentionally, and someone from high school appears. New house, new baby, promotion announcement written like a press release. And for just a moment, something tightens in your chest. Not quite jealousy, something quieter than that. Something that sounds like, why haven't I figured it out yet? Leon Festinger called it social comparison theory, the idea that humans instinctively measure their own progress against the people around them. It was a reasonable survival mechanism when those people were your actual neighbors. Here's what I need you to sit with for a moment. You are not behind. You are measuring yourself against a performance, not a life, with a ruler that was never calibrated to reality.
The person in that post isn't showing you their Tuesday. They're showing you their best Saturday. And somewhere right now, they are probably scrolling past your life feeling exactly the same thing. I want to slow down here for a moment, because there's something that doesn't get named nearly enough, and it needs to be named, clearly, without fanfare, without a motivational soundtrack behind it. You kept going, through a job market that redefined itself under your feet, through a housing ladder that quietly pulled its bottom rung away. So let's return to where we started. You were built for a world that no longer exists. And for a long time, that felt like the problem. But here is what I think is actually true. You are the last generation that remembers what it felt like to exist inside a moment before the moment had to mean something. Before it needed a caption. Before it was optimized for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. You lived whole afternoons that no one recorded. That memory of a self that belonged entirely to itself is something the generations after you will never carry. That's not a wound. That's an inheritance. And it's yours. In the comments, don't leave a story. Leave the feeling that still doesn't have a name.